Hello everyone, thanks so much for joining. So today we're going to talk about training tips. So we're going to cover who am I and where do I work, some training tips that myself and my team has learned from going from being developers to training librarians. So things in terminology when doing training, in-person training tips, remote training tips, and a chance for questions at the end. So I work for Catalyst IT, which was founded in New Zealand in 1997. And since then we have spread, as you can see, this image shows all the different offices we've got around the world. So we're in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, and Canada now. And the Canada office opened relatively recently. So Catalyst is a company that specialises in open source softwares and technologies. And the Koha team at Catalyst is one of many different teams that work on lots of different systems. And we have, Catalyst also supports open source initiatives like, for example, the open source awards every year where different organizations and systems are awarded for their contributions to open source or for a particularly great implementation of open source systems. And another big initiative that the Koha team is involved in at Catalyst is the open source, the academy, the Catalyst Academy. So that runs usually every year around January, and that is where a bunch of high school students come in for 2 weeks into Catalyst and they get taught about different open source technologies. They learn about a lot of different technologies like Git and other things like that. So that's the first week, and then the second week is where they will work on contributing to a open source project, one of which is Koha. And the Koha community is always so wonderful in testing and QAing patches that the students have worked on, and it really helps people get into the tech industry. The tech lead in our team, Alicia, started in the academy, and that was her introduction into the tech industry. So it really shows that it's a really great initiative to get people interested and looking into a career in tech. And who am I? Well, I started as an intern at Catalyst 2015, and I'm a remote worker. I'm based in Nelson at the top of the South Island of New Zealand. And I work on a whole lot of different things, one of which is data migrations and implementations of Koha, and also training during those implementations, taking librarians that are used to a different system and training them up on how Koha works and how they can transfer their old workflows into how to do it with Koha. And outside of work, travel is my passion. So I am on a 8.5 month long overseas journey, and I've just had 3.5 months house and cat sitting in Mexico while remote working there. So if any of you enjoy travel, I'd love to chat. And I wanted to do a cute little reference to New Zealand with my talk's title. So it's Tip Top Training Tips. In New Zealand, Tip Top is kind of an iconic ice cream brand. And so lots of corner shops, which are called dairies in New Zealand, will have the Tip Top branding like you can see on the screen. And I also just recently found out Finland has the largest consumption of ice cream per capita in the world. And so I thought that was a nice connection between New Zealand and Finland there. So let's get into the talk. So terminology. So as a developer, or even as a librarian training, it's very easy to fall into your default language of using jargon as a kind of shorthand to save time. And we have found that actually takes so much longer because either people get confused and will ask questions, so you spend more time explaining the jargon you're talking about than just explaining it properly the first time. So people sometimes get confused, but also some people don't feel comfortable asking questions, so they might just come out of the training confused about what you've been talking about. So one of the things we've learnt is to avoid assuming knowledge. So a lot of people attending trainings, we have a whole range from systems librarians, and then circulation and cataloguing librarians, and then library volunteers as well. And oftentimes library volunteers might come from a non-library background. They might have no library experience and not that much technical experience. And so if you start talking to them about even library concepts like MARC or things like that, then that might go over their heads too. So it's important to avoid going into the training assuming that the people be really experts in librarian concepts, not just technical ones. Yeah, so like I said, you don't want to alienate people because you might have a range of different experiences, some librarians, some library volunteers, and you don't want to go too heavy into the librarian jargon. So if we have a look at a few examples, rather than saying holding branch, and this was one that came up recently, where when talking about holding branch to a new librarian that hadn't used Koha before and didn't have that much library knowledge, she was wondering, she asked, well, what do you mean by holding branch? So rather than saying holding branch, you could instead say the current physical location where the item is. Or borrower category, that's quite a Koha specific, a lot of these are quite Koha specific terminologies. So you could say type of borrower and then give an example like staff or students or library staff. And then bibliographic framework, that's another very Koha specific thing. And you could just say a template of data fields used for cataloguing a particular type of title. You don't even need to get into the MARC there because again, someone might not know what MARC is, so you could just say data fields instead. Technical jargon. So quite a lot of non-technical people find the acronyms and jargon and technology very frustrating, like this person here is. And so we always do our very best to avoid using jargon unless we're training technical people like developers. So let's look at a few examples for this. So these examples here aren't super technical and are kind of Koha specific again, but things like if you're training and you'll just default to say opaque main user block, well, someone that's new to Koha probably has no idea what you're talking about there. And so it's better to just say the main section of the home page or the middle section of the home page below the search. Navigation, you might think, being used to working with computers, that most people know what navigation is, but again, some people might not. So you could just say the sidebar menu. Similarly, header, someone might not know what you're talking about with that, so you could just say the top of the page usually has a large banner image, a large stretched image across the top. Then if we get into more technical things, this is where the problem comes in. So rather than address bar, you could just say the search box or the search bar with the address of the website. Similarly, URL, you could just say the address of the website. Single sign-on, that's something that trips a lot of people up. So you could just say, without getting too deep with it, what SSO stands for, single sign-on, and that it's a way for users to log into one system and they're authenticated across lots of other systems, so they don't have to have 10 different passwords, they can just have one password. And two-factor authentication. So you could just say you need a password and you might need to do an approval on your phone or enter a code. And then you could give the example with lots of online banking, when you log into there, you have to do a password, but then you often have to do something else, like approve a notification on your phone, enter a texted number to you, something like that. So give an example to explain it with something that most people would have used online banking. In-person training. So this photo actually is from a in-person training that our team did earlier this year. And you can see in this photo Catherine standing and then Alicia and Danyan from our team. And it's been so great to get back into in-person training after so many years during the pandemic. So we're still getting back into that, but it's so good because we find building that connection so much easier in in-person training, much easier than remote training, but I'll get on to that. So some tips that we've learnt from in-person training over the last 3 or 4 years: ask questions before the training session. So you want to know as much as possible about who's going to be attending the training, and so some examples of things you might want to ask are things like, how long have people been using Koha? What's their level of knowledge? So do you have lots of experts? Do you have a combination of experts and novices? This will help you tailor the training to the audience. Any particular workflows, problems or questions, do the trainees have any of those that they'd like to cover? Why would you want to ask this? Well, firstly, this will give you an idea of these are the things in more detail. They might just say, I'm interested in circulation, but are you interested in reserves? Are you interested in just checking in and out? What specifically do you want to know? And also, if there's questions or problems, if you don't know the answer to the problem before, if they say, I've got this problem and you're not sure of the answer, you have a chance to go away and research it before and then present the answer at the training, rather than being put on the spot and have to say, I'll come back to you later. Also, if there's questions they have or things that they want to cover, you'll be able to make time at the end of the training, because you know someone might have a particular question. So you'll know beforehand to factor time in for that. Whereas if you just start the training and say, does anyone have any questions or problems, you might not have factored in enough time to actually cover that. Explaining the goal of an exercise before doing it. So what we like to do is explain before doing any exercises what are we trying to achieve, what is this going to accomplish, rather than just jumping straight in. The reason you would do this is people pay more attention, because if you've asked those questions at the start of the training, then you've made the exercises actually relevant to the library most likely. And so when you say we're doing this because it's achieving one of those things you said you wanted, then they're probably going to pay more attention, they're probably going to be more engaged, and they're probably going to ask more questions because it's actually something they need to know. Also, if your exercise isn't relevant to them, by explaining we're doing this because, they'll be able to tell you, well actually, so for example, if you're doing an exercise in the acquisitions module and you're saying we're doing this, we're going to set up a fund and a budget and create an order, maybe they don't use the acquisitions module in Koha, they'll be able to tell you that and you'll be able to skip it and keep the training relevant to them. Don't take over. So training in Koha, it's very easy sometimes if someone has a question or gets stuck to just jump in and take over and try and be too helpful. But the problem with that is people aren't going to learn if you just take over and they're just watching. They need to do it themselves. And so you need to sit on your hands and you need to give them a goal for what they need to be able to do, and give them some tips and ideas of how they could do it, and ask them to go ahead and try it. If they get stuck, you can go over but don't take over the mouse. Don't just sit next to them and verbally explain, guide them how to do it themselves, give them some ideas of where to look. Don't take over. And then also don't point at the screen. Instead, describe where on the screen they should be clicking. The reason for that is they will actually end up looking at observing the screen more. They'll notice more things about the staff client or OPAC, and whereas if you just point, they'll miss all of that context. So they might notice some other button and then ask a question, what does this do? So it's really good for them to learn more about Koha that way. Demoing. So we always, if you're doing a training for novices, you can't take so much of the approach of just explain we're going to go to circulations and do this and that. You have to do a demonstration to give them a bit more context of what to do, whereas with a more experienced user you can be much more generic and just verbally describe, we're going to do this, we're trying to achieve this. So with demos, we always try and we would do a walkthrough demonstration ourselves, and then we will provide a different example to trainees. The reason for that is we don't want to, the different example means that they have to think about it. So you're doing a demonstration, we're going to circulate this item, or we're going to catalogue this book. And then the different example would be, let's catalogue a different book. It will be slightly different to what you've done. It makes the user actually, the trainee, think about what they're going to do. You don't want to make it too much of a copy-paste or prescriptive exercise where they don't have to think, they just copy what you've written. It's all about making them think and challenge them. Asking questions, this is a really important one. So, as I mentioned before, some people are uncomfortable asking questions, and so if they don't understand, they won't say I don't understand, or they won't clarify, they won't ask you to clarify, they'll just sit there, but then they might come out of the training confused about what you've talked about. So we try and ask questions. So we will, rather than saying to the group in the training, does everyone understand, we will ask people, we'll give them a scenario and then ask them, what would you do in this scenario? And that actually tests their knowledge. So, for example, you might say, we're going to check an item out to this borrower. How would you go about doing that? Where would you go? What would you click? What would you do? And then if they can explain that, they obviously understand what you're talking about, rather than just asking generically, do you understand? Remote training. So this is something we got very used to over the last few years, and I usually work remotely anyway, so this is my usual way of running training sessions now. And it's really good in that you can train people in expensive to reach places or hard to reach places, but then the downside is there's so much less of that human contact, which makes things like people feel comfortable to ask questions or to engage more. It's a bit detaching. So how can you get around the fact that remote training is more detached? Well, we always get people to introduce themselves at the start of a training session. So it would be easy to just jump straight in and not go through the introductions and not get more idea about who everyone is and what they want. But it's so vital to do that. So you would have asked questions before the training from someone, one of the trainees, to say what's everyone want to cover. But in the start of the training, ask people again, how long have they been at the organisation, how long have they used Koha, what their experience is, and what are they hoping to learn. Again, this is just to build some form of connection to kind of try and alleviate the fact that it's remote. Because these are the sort of things people would have natural conversations with over a coffee before training at an in-person session. So you're just trying to replicate it to some degree. Testing video conference links. So we've all been in a training session or a meeting where people, the first 10 minutes has been troubleshooting the connection, and of course that's 10 minutes out of the training session. So we always try to set up, if someone's not used the platform that we use, which is Big Blue Button at Catalyst, if someone's not used that before, we always try and send them a link beforehand and ask them to jump in with us to test their audio, to show them how to see the slides that we're sharing or see the screen that we're sharing. Saves time at the start of the training. It saves the trainer having to do on-the-spot troubleshooting with everyone else sitting waiting. And it enables you, if there's a firewall rule at the organisation which stops you using your normal video conference platform, you can switch to something else beforehand and get straight into those intros and the actual content of the session. keeping it short, so we have learnt from our experience that remote trainings tend to be more tiring than in person, both for the trainer and the trainee. So we always try and keep trainings to no more than 2 hours long for remote training sessions. If we have, say, 8 hours of content to get through, we will do multiple 2-hour sessions, either over multiple days or separated with breaks. Otherwise, we have found that people get drained, they're not engaged as much, and it's a bit of a waste of time after the 2 hours non-stop. This would seem like a self-evident thing, but it's amazing how many people don't do this. With people attending trainings a lot from noisy open space offices or from home with all the background noise there, all of that going on can be very distracting, and sometimes it's cute, like when a cat's wandering past and meowing, but oftentimes there's just lots of background chatter. So, and also when everyone tries to talk at the same time. So we always try and encourage people at the start to mute, just a reminder to mute the mics when they're not speaking. So this one, asking trainees to share their cameras. As I mentioned, the thing with in-person communication, as we know, most of it is non-verbal. So if you are a trainer and you're just talking to a black screen because no one's sharing their camera, you're not going to see if someone's confused or if they're disengaged or something like that. If you can see them, so if the bandwidth allows and they're comfortable, you can actually, if someone's looking confused, you can follow up with them, or you can say, ask them a question so you just know a bit more about what's going on at their end. So we always try and ask people to share their cameras, and that kind of, again, alleviates a bit of the fact that remote training's so much more restrictive than in-person training. Also, if you're just talking to a black screen, it can be very off-putting for the trainer, because you don't know how's this being received. This is one of our favourite tips for remote training, asking for someone to volunteer. To screen share rather than the trainer just doing that. So as you can imagine, sometimes you ask people to volunteer to screen share and you don't get any takers, in which case we kind of select someone. It's preferable if that person is not an expert in Koha. You don't want someone that's just going to whiz through all the examples. You want someone that would make the same mistake as, you want someone that's probably one of the least experienced in the group, so they'll make the same mistake as everyone else would. If that person gets stuck, we always ask everyone else in the group, what would you do? Can you help this person? That lets other people test their Koha knowledge that they've learnt, rather than you just telling them. So get some of that collaboration going between the trainees. Respecting the contributions. So I once attended a training session where I asked a question. It was a technical training session. I asked a question and was criticised because being told I should have known the answer. The trouble with that is that actually puts everyone else off asking a question in case they get the same response. So incredibly counterproductive. So we always try and acknowledge everyone's questions, answer them as best we can in the session or follow up afterwards. And we always believe that there is no stupid question, only a stupid answer, like saying, you should know that. We always have someone else taking an assistant to the trainer taking notes. That way the trainer can actually focus on engaging with the attendees, not trying to pause and take notes all the time. Also, if you tell the trainees beforehand someone else is taking notes, then they don't need to worry about taking notes. They'll be more engaged throughout. And it's just helpful to have that support person there. Once that backup person's taken notes, you want to send those notes out afterwards. So we always email the notes out afterwards. If someone's asked a question, in the training session or you couldn't answer it and you need to follow up afterwards, we include those questions and answers so everyone learns, not just the one person that asked the question. And also encourage people to email you further questions, because people might not have thought of a question in the training session. They need time to digest what you've talked about, digest the notes, and then they'll have questions. One of the great things about being a trainer, so in te reo culture in New Zealand, there's the idea of tuakana teina, which is the idea that you have a mentor and a mentee and they learn from one another. So in trainings we have found you will teach the librarians or the library volunteers about koha, but they will teach you this is how our library works or this is how we use koha. So it's very much a reciprocity kind of idea. It's not a one-way stream of knowledge, it's both ways, and that's why we love training. And I would like to thank you all very much for attending, and please let me know if you have questions.
Thank you so much. That was very engaging and informative. If anyone has questions, I will bring you the microphone so we can have them on the stream.
Hello. In e-training, how do you manage exercise part of the training? The exercise for the people. How do they practice?
We will usually give them a scenario, like we're going to check this item out to someone, or here's a book we're going to catalogue and here's a title or something like that. And then we'll give them the basic scenario after we've demoed it, and then we will ask them to go away and try that, and let us know how they got on, if they had any problems, if they have any questions. So we'll kind of give them a few steps at the start, and then they can do the rest of the workflow.
Any else? Yes.
On your very first slides, you meant do not assume knowledge, but I think it's really good also, even with knowledgeable, like everyone is knowledgeable, but with even expert people, to put some basic vocabulary and context, because even for navigation, for example, even if I'm Koha expert, on a different context, navigation could just mean GPS.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very good point.
Thank you.
Hey Alex, I was just wondering how many staff you have helping you do training at Catalyst.
We try and keep the groups relatively small, so I think usually we keep it to 7 or 8 is kind of the maximum, especially for remote trainings, because more than that it gets a bit too big, too many people. So we try and keep it to 7 or 8, unless some of the in-person trainings are bigger, so we've had up to 20 for those, but then we have multiple members of our team there to help individual people.
Thank you.
One question from me. Do you use breakout rooms then? Because sometimes we have multiple people who know what we're teaching about, and then we can ask if anyone has a specific question and wants to only look at it in breakout rooms because they're embarrassed or something, and then...
That's a really good point. So we haven't used breakout rooms, but that's something we can look at. It sounds a really good idea. Sometimes if one person has a particular question that everyone else knows the answer about or is not interested in knowing that particular thing, we'll go and individually train them and give everyone else an exercise, but not as a separate breakout room.
So, any more questions?
Not a question, just Te Wainui's watching you on the live stream back in New Zealand, and she said you did great.
Thanks, Wainui.
Will you share your slides?
I will indeed.
Yes, the link to the slides were in the beginning as well. So, if there's not any more questions, we will let you all go downstairs and have some coffee and pastries. And remember to talk to each other.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex.